Today's guest is Dr. Paddy Barrett. Paddy Barrett is a famed cardiologist and a preventative medicine expert. This is a really interesting conversation. Instead of waiting for illness to creep up on us and treating the symptoms, Paddy advocates an entirely different approach with his patients and with his listeners. He says, take action now. And that's what this podcast is. This podcast is a guide, what actions we can take now to avoid chronic health problems later in life. Not everybody is ready to hear this conversation, but if you are, get ready to go deep. It's Dr. Paddy Barrett. Dr. Barrett, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
How are you today?
I am very, very good.
I had a conversation. I went out walking the dog just before this, and I always try and create that space to think about how the conversation is going to develop. And I was walking the dog, and I was thinking back to a conversation I had with one of the top endurance coaches in the world a couple of months ago. I'm not sure if this was an off-air conversation. It most probably was. And he shared with me a story about a friend who had dropped dead that week. And initially I thought this was a tragic story, and his friend was in his 90s. He said he rode the bike with his friend that morning. They'd done a 100-mile bike ride. His friend got off the bike and he'd done a 10-mile run on his indoor treadmill. He sat down, had his recovery drink at home, and then he passed away peacefully having his recovery drink. Initially I thought this is a very sad story, and I was sending my commiserations. And the more I reflected on it, I thought, that's the way I want to go. Contrasting that to people that, they retire, they look forward to retirement their whole life. They retire at 70 and then they've no mobility. They can't do any of the exercises they love. One, we're talking about kind of lifespan, I guess, how long someone lives, and health span being the quality of our life. How do we narrow that gap between health span and lifespan? That's where I want to kind of focus the conversation today.
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of perennial question that we're all trying to answer. It's funny, if you go and speak to the Healthy Centenarian cohort, a group I was involved with in Scripps in San Diego, we're doing a kind of a genome study on this particular group, but a lot of it was around kind of surveys and chatting to them. And they all use this line of they all want to die by being shot in the back by a jealous lover at age kind of like 105. And so I think that it is the ultimate of morbidity compression, where your health span has maximized and you get no drop in performance or capacity, and then you just die suddenly doing something that you love. And I think this is what everyone is aiming for, and that's this idea of squaring the curve in terms of matching kind of your lifespan with the health span component. And I think where this gets difficult is how you actually define health span in terms of what your objectives or metrics or performance are within that, and understanding that they will naturally change over time. So it's not that we will be able to do what we're able to do now or in your 20s and 30s at, say, 70 and 80 years of age, but it's about understanding what would be a reasonably aspirational thing to do over those time horizons. And that's the way I try and look at it, because we're all going to have decreases in performance, for the most part, regardless of what we do. And so this is really down to this idea, in my view, of this idea of morbidity compression. So the illness period that you have that is going to precede your death, assuming that your death is going to be from a major chronic disease, which we know that that's the case in 90% of patients. How can you minimize that period of morbidity compression and maximize the time period before it, which is then really looking at the definition of health span being the time period of your life without a major chronic disease. And so it's about extending that time period and then minimizing the time with it before you die.
I'm reading an interesting book called Wanting at the moment. That's the idea of why we want what we want. We're notoriously bad at figuring out what we want. We end up just mimicking what our peer group wants. So for a lot of us, it's hard to project what we want in that marginal decade of our lives. Like, do we want to be able to still run a 25-minute sub 5K? Do we want to have a functional threshold on the bike? It's difficult to project that. At least it was for me. What I found really interesting was the idea of forecasting. There's definitely stuff I know I want to be able to do. I want to be able to stand out of a chair without assistance. Now, if I look at my current ability to squat and I build in expected muscle atrophy through the years and say, oh shit, if I can't squat, picking an arbitrary figure of like 80 kilograms at the moment, I'm not going to be able to stand up out of a chair unassisted at age 85. That's when the alarm bells went in my head and saying, I don't know what I concretely want, but I definitely know what I don't want. I don't want to need assistance to get out of a chair.
Yeah, and so the way I look at this is probably the same as you're doing. I just call it backcasting, in terms of, you say, listen, what are my goals? And then I have to work backwards and see what metrics do I have to hit along the way, understanding the natural attrition of those performance metrics going backwards. So you have to, the line is, you have to be above average now if you want to be above average at 80 or 90 years of age. And I think this idea, though, of forecasting what it is that you want from a performance and a health basis is notoriously hard to do. Because if you look at, say, surveys of people who have a major diagnosis of a cancer that's an advanced cancer, and then you look at the likelihood of them receiving, say, heroic type surgeries, or say chemotherapy, or advanced kind of chemotherapy that's really kind of last ditch efforts. And we see this happen all the time in clinical medicine, that people undergo often procedures, or they say receive chemotherapy. And, you're looking at this as a clinician, you're saying, God, the odds are just, not really that great here. And, to be honest, I probably wouldn't do that if I were in the same position. And when you survey doctors and you ask them, would you take the heroic surgery, or would you go on the kind of the experimental chemotherapy that had a very small chance of working? Uniformly, the doctors say that they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't take the surgery. They wouldn't, take the chemotherapy. But what's amazing is that if you actually then follow those doctors, and then you find them in the scenario where they are actually facing this cancer diagnosis, they routinely take the surgery. They routinely, take the heroic chemotherapy option. And so I think where you are now, it's very hard to know what your aspirations will be and what your goals will be in the future, because you're making your kind of plans based on being, ostensibly young and kind of healthy, fit individual. And so, we've seen this with measures of happiness when people win the lottery, for example. Happiness measures go up for the first year afterwards, and then roughly end up kind of, the same a couple of years later. If you look at individuals who are, say, paraplegics or tetraplegics, they, you look at the devastating impact that holds on someone's quality of life. But if you look at their quality of life in terms of their ability to interact with loved ones, etc., and maybe do way less than they were able to do before, many of them are still very happy. It's not to say that all of them are, as happy as they were before. But I think it also really raises the question that where we derive our happiness from, or our sense of meaning, or our sense that, we're able to do what it is that we want to do, may well be vastly different in the future. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't set ourselves up for success for the standard metrics of, being able to get up unassisted, or walk through an airport, or do those things. But I think it's a very hard one to predict.
Yeah, no, 100%. And happiness is so intertwined with all this, because I think for a long time, we definitely, and academics especially, have been guilty of looking at stuff in silos. Let's talk about physical strength. Let's talk about aerobic fitness. Let's talk about nutrition. Let's talk about happiness. When the reality is, if you go out for a run, you're working your muscles, you're working your aerobic system, but you're having a massive serotonin uptake in that as well. Like, you're coming back in, you're absolutely buzzing after it. So in practice, it affects everything, but then we academically just want to separate them and don't talk about the interlink between all this. Whenever I've looked at the Blue Zone studies, like, one of the big things that's in that, it's community, the interlinkedness of people living with multi-generational families, friends, contributing to local community. It's very interesting to observe.
Yeah, and I think these are such complex interactions. It's so hard to parse them kind of into their separate buckets. And this is why I somewhat make another axis of health in terms of the way I talk about health. I talk about lifespan. This is a kind of a binary thing. You're either dead or alive, and that's duration. Health span is your physical capacity to be able to do certain things in the world, and your cognitive capacity to have kind of the maintained executive function to be able to behave in the world. But I then split it out into soul span is the third axis of health. And that's entirely manufactured. I made that up. There's no, scientific basis to that. But it's what I think of as, health span and lifespan for me are basically buying optionality of how you're going to spend your life and your time. Because we all know examples of people who are fit and healthy well into old age, but maybe haven't made the right choices in terms of how they're going to spend their time. We know people who, may have significant, shortening of their life or impacts on their health span by our metrics, but have spent their lives in such a way that they're inspirational, and that they were truly engaged and motivated with their life and aligned everything that they did with their own intrinsic value systems. Because all of us will reach a terminus, as the Fight Club line goes, in terms of over a long enough time horizon, all survival drops to zero.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that's a static fact for all of us. So we have to ask is, what are you going to do with that time? And I'll be honest, my interest in this area primarily is in that latter question. I think the lifespan and health span piece are really important, and they're interesting, and we can study them much more scientifically. But it's all in service of how you're going to spend your time.
And the interrelatedness of even that last fact, the soul span. So we talked about blue zones having community. I've seen a recent study on the difference in how attached you feel to your local community, to your local neighborhood, based if you're a renter or based if you're a home owner. So you look at things now like inflation, house prices going out of control where a lot of people can't get on the property ladder. It might seem like just a fiscal problem that we have to deal with, but it's actually so connected to health, because if we can't get on the property ladder, we're less likely to be connected with that community. If we're less likely to be connected with community, we're less likely to make friends. We're less likely to optimize what you're calling soul span.
Yeah. And like, I think, the Buddhist communities had this right for thousands of years. I mean, happiness and dissatisfaction are basically the delta between your expectation and your perceived future reality. And I think, you're finding generations of people whose perceived future reality, whether it's true or not, in many ways seems less likely to be better than it was for their parents, for example. They're less likely to own a home. They're running into issues in terms of kind of basic, simple things like being able to have the space to have a family, for example, to have that core group of a community around them, people that they can call friends, and a network of people around them. And that's happened for a variety of reasons. So, we've seen just spectacular increases in average lifespan and reductions in chronic diseases. But our enjoyment of life is fundamentally down to the gap between our expectations and our reality. And for a lot of things and a lot of people, their expectations are falling kind of down. And so it's a negative trajectory rather than a positive one.
So when someone comes into the practice and they're expecting to be prescribed statins, you're prescribing them Marcus Aurelius's meditations.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, one of the things that I, quote unquote, prescribe all the time are books. I really do, because I think so much of our problems in the world are down to kind of framing. And I don't know who said this, but it's definitely, I'm paraphrasing someone else, but if you look at your story, you can ask, is it your fortress or your fuel? And so is your story that it was your past? Is it something that you use to hide behind and hide within? Or is it your fuel to move you forward? And so for me, this has a double edge to it. And again, I think the soul span is the most important piece, because not only do I believe it is the most important, because fundamentally we're here for a limited time and it's about how you're going to spend that time. But secondly, it becomes the motivation to do the hard things that are required to achieve the performances in lifespan and health span. And so this is where for me personally, my interest in this, in terms of exercising on a regular basis and focusing on all these metrics, was largely born out of the birth of my children as well. And because it's simply, I had kids later in life, and you do the simple math and you look at the milestones of, how old is my two children, how old are they going to be in these particular timeframes, and what age am I going to be? And I look at kind of peer groups who are those ages, and, will I be happy having that functional capacity at that age, if that's the average for that? And it gets scary in terms of, because you look at maybe your own parents who had children much younger, maybe in their 20s and early 20s, and there's a delta of 20 years there that you have to make up. And that's one of the big reasons for me that motivated me to personally become engaged with this.
And average is such a strange term. It's a moving target in a lot of ways, and kind of the bell-shaped curve, because what the average IQ in the US at the moment is 70 or something like that. So like, I don't think we should be striving for average in any of this stuff.
Well, average is, it's such a term fraught with difficulties. There's a famous story, and I think it's with Lockheed Martin, that they were making what they believed was like the average cockpit configuration to actually fit the pilots. And so what they did was they looked at all the pilots and looked at their different shapes and sizes, and they worked out the average. And so what they did was they made an average shaped cockpit that ultimately fit no one. Because so, and this is the challenge in terms of when we're looking at averages. Again, and like averages, I think have their utility in terms of how we use it, but no one aims for average, and that's that's the problem. But again, as the line goes, 50% of people believe that they're 90% of people believe that they're above average.
Yeah, it's like there's a brilliant. I'm not sure our international listeners won't get this at all, but you can check it on YouTube. You mightn't have even seen it yourself. It's a cartoon years ago, Sminky Shorts. They're on YouTube. They're hilarious. But in one of them, there's an auctioneer rabbit, and he's selling a burrow, which is a home, to a fat rabbit, and the fat rabbit can't get in the door of the burrow. The opening's too small, and the estate agent's saying to him, "Look, I assure you it's an average size hole, but it's a plenty roomy inside." And he's saying, "What's the point of a plenty roomy inside if I can't get in the door?"
Yeah, it's. I think when it's about looking at the deficiencies of that word average. I mean, if you look at the average number of, say, smokers in Ireland is approximately 20%. I think it's dropped to about 17%. And then when most people listen to that figure, so that's about a kind of approximately a 1 in 5 figure, and then they do the math in their head and they go, 1 in 5 people are smokers, and then they look at their own friend group and they go 1, 2, they go, that doesn't add up. And the reality is that if you're in a higher socioeconomic class, that number is way, 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 way less. But if you're in a lower socioeconomic class and you haven't had a job for over 6 months, that figure is about kind of 40 to 50%. And so again, this is where averages really distort figures. But they also have their use. I mean, the key difference here when we talk about lifespan is that if we look at average lifespan has improved massively over the last several thousand years in terms of if you look at the average duration of life. But maximum lifespan has improved very, very marginally. And so we always need to be kind of mindful of the differences between those two things. And we currently don't have on the horizon, at least in the near term, a step function change in how we're going to live to 130 or 40 or 50 years of age. So fundamentally, when we talk about lifespan and health span, we're really talking about A, not dying young, and B, also maybe an extra 5 to 10 years and hopefully at a higher quality. But in the grander scheme, as a percentage of your life, that's substantial. But in the grander scheme of things, in the terms of the universe, these are tiny, tiny drops in the ocean, which is why I think even with the best effort in the world and every, factor dialed to the optimum, you're going to be here for a short time. And we have to think about how we're going to spend that time. And this is when you look at the literature in terms of when people are surveyed at the end of their life and you ask them, what is it that they regret in terms of how they lived their life? Number 2, routinely, is that I worked too hard. And as the line goes, the only people who are going to remember that you stayed late at work are your kids.
Yeah.
And the number 1 regret is that people say that I didn't have the courage to live the life that I always knew that I should have. And I think that's the really scary thing, is that when people talk about the life that they want to live, the soul span piece of this, it's not a mystery. And although, as you alluded to earlier, there is the mimetic theory of René Girard in terms of being influenced by our environments. But as Charles Bukowski said, who were you before the world told you who you should be? And deep down, I think when people really reflect on that question, they know And they fundamentally know in their soul who they are and who they should be, evolving across time. And we know when we are further away from that. And
well, it's like,
again,
what activities bend time for you? I always think, like, if I go out on a bike ride, I'll routinely on a day off jump on my bike, I'll go out and I'll look down at the clock and I'll be like, oh my God, I'm gone for 5 hours. I should really check in with the missus in case she thinks I've had a bang of a car. Time just disappears when you're doing activities that light you up. Other people have this experience when they go surfing, they disappear for the day. By the same token, there's other stuff I can do. And I'm out there, like I've started trying to play chess, and, you know, I'll be playing, I think I'm playing for hours, and I'll look up in like 15 minutes. It's like, oh, this is just not for me. But I think we can experiment with that stuff a lot and see what lights us up.
And that is the pursuit of your internal values. That is the pursuit of the things, you know, that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I can never say the second name correctly, has identified in his research on flow. This idea of a state of time where you have fluidity of time, and so time either dilates or is compressed. And I think, you know, your goal in life is to constantly be searching for what those activities are, and then constantly go up the hierarchy of challenge in those domains. And like one of the questions that has always puzzled me in terms of, again, I'm not unique to this, is, you know, is the why are we here? This question of the meaning of life. And I think the two things that I've taken away from it is that, you know, is there going to be a question, an answer to this question, or again, a fundamental? Is it going to be like 6? And the reality is, you know, we're not going to get that answer, but it doesn't mean that life cannot be meaningful, that you cannot participate in activities that are meaningful. And the second thing is a comment by the neuroscientist Sam Harris, is that the meaning of life is the wrong question to ask. The meaning of life is about finding yourself in the activity whereby that question falls away, whereby to even ask that question would be a ridiculous activity.
Because the meaning of life for me, it feels like I'm deferring fun for down the road, that I should be. It's the opposite to presence. It's the opposite to memento mori that the Stoics talk about, because we're focusing on, you know, how am I going to be remembered in these grandiose terms like legacy, when the reality is we might have it. Tomorrow's not promised to any of us. No. And so this is, again, you know, we're kind of wildly off topic, but in the domain of kind of what I find the most interesting is this idea of that everyone's on an immortality quest. And that everyone is trying to live forever. And historically, we lived forever in a literal sense, that there was a religion layered on top of our belief systems, whereby when we died, we went somewhere else and we lived there forever. That evolved into the continuous survival of the soul, for example. So kind of your physical body died, but your soul persisted. But there are many other forms of immortality, not just literal immortality, but it's symbolic immortality. You survive forever through your children. You survive forever through your legacy of works. You survive forever through kind of various different activities or monuments or pieces of art, for example. And so the bottom line is whether you believe it or not, everyone is on some form of an immortality quest. And so you have to ask yourself, what immortality quest are you on? Because everyone's on one. And to pivot slightly into the health span idea, because I think people are really interested in the tactics in it as well. And one of the problems I've seen in the current health span is we're not defining our starting point well enough. In endurance sports, we're very, very good at getting a snapshot of where we are now. You know, we've a battery of tests, from VO2 max tests, aerobic tests, to see exactly where we are, put a line in the sand and say, this is where I am right now. I think GPs in general are, now I don't want to cast a wide net on GPs, but this is my anecdotal experience. When I've been to GPs, they've been very poor at helping me understand the metrics of looking under the hood to say, this is the line in the sand of where you're at now. Here's the key performance indicators you should be looking to improve. Can you help me understand how I draw that line in the sand for determining where my health's at now?
So the first comment I would make is on the primary care doctor challenge. Primary care doctors and specialty doctors like myself are not trained to set up our practices that way. That's an historical function of how medicine has been set up to be a reactive condition to the management of chronic diseases. So the idea that you would go to your doctor when you are well to avoid disease is an entirely new concept. So the momentum that is the structure of medicine is designed to be reactive to the appearance of a chronic disease. And secondly, because there is so much chronic disease, GPs are completely overwhelmed by the management of very sick, multi-morbid patients. And so, in terms of the vehicle that is primary care is not set up largely to manage the question that you're trying to ask. And then what happens is someone like you kind of presents that question to any doctor, and they're described as the worried well. But my pushback on that is that, the time to be worried is when you're well, because when you're not well, worrying isn't going to help. And so to answer your question in terms of those metrics, I think, again, the backcasting or forecasting model is really useful in terms of looking at a kind of on a percentile basis where you are from a functional fitness perspective, and say from VO2 max or muscle strength or muscle mass. And you can project out fairly clearly in terms of endurance sports, kind of if you want to hit a certain metric in time, you have to have certain performance metrics kind of prior. So you can do that. And so you're trying to emulate that model in terms of health span. So my general kind of aspiration for patients is they're not below average in terms of, the 50th percentile. Ideally, they should be higher, but at least they're not below average, because trying to get, past that is way harder. But I think the second thing to identify is that if you're focusing on health span largely is the function of not having a major chronic disease. And not having a major chronic disease means that you avoid or manage the risk factors for that major chronic disease much more aggressively, earlier, and for longer. And I think this is, again, a function of how we look at cardiovascular disease as the example. So the leading cause of death worldwide, and kind of the number 1, 2 in the developed countries. If you look at how we kind of manage the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, say, abnormal lipids or cholesterol, or say blood pressure, the decision tree in terms of how we should kind of approach that is based on your risk model defined over a 10-year time horizon. And so if you're a 40-year-old individual, using a 10-year risk calculator to make decisions about how you should manage those risks is just not going to be adequate. And so my kind of general throwaway line on this is that 10-year risk calculators are only useful for people planning on living another 10 years.
Yeah, it's like if I want to optimize to be the fittest person on the planet, aged 95 years old, how am I calibrating my actions now?
Sorry there, I think we dropped.
Sorry, I dropped you briefly there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know what's... Sorry, do you want to start your last question?
Yeah, I'll start last question again. Yeah, editor will earn his money here. So if I am looking to optimize to be the fittest 95-year-old person on the planet, and I'm starting to think about that now, age 40, what actions do I need to be starting to take now to get there when I'm 95? Because as you say, that 10-year time horizon, it's like, it's largely irrelevant.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of the physiological metrics that you're going to make in terms of performance, I'm sure you've covered these extensively in terms of the podcast. But when I look at this from kind of a disease perspective, what you want to do is you want to certainly avoid a major chronic disease that is avoidable. And most specifically, we're talking here about cardiovascular disease. And so if you look at your, say, cholesterol burden that your, say, may have kind of a genetic determinant of, that's something that you may need to address much earlier in life. And you need to think about a much longer time horizon of risk for that. So often people will present, in their kind of 40s with, say, an abnormal lipid profile. It's not going to be the only determinant of risk, but it's a significant contributor of risk. And when you actually look at a lifetime risk model, we'll say out to 80 years of age, as opposed to a 10-year risk model, and you show the deltas in risk between, managing it now versus waiting, there's much bigger risk reductions on the table. Because as I say, in terms of we're not interested in managing risk over a 5-year time horizon, it has to be over a 50-year time horizon for that particular individual. And so sometimes, if you've exceeded your lifestyle interventions at that time point, you have to think about layering on additional kind of therapies. And so kind of when we think about, say, the inclusion of, say, like a lipid lowering therapy, people are much more aggressive to use it at that time point. When we look at things like management of blood pressure, again, we have to be stricter about, if we're aiming for above average, we have to be slightly stricter in terms of our targets earlier for life, because we know that it's the cumulative exposure of that risk factor over time. And so that's the key thing that we're looking at here. If we look at kind of the underlying factors that are driving a lot of these major chronic diseases, particularly, say, high blood pressure, is going to be a factor like insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. And as you move up through that spectrum of disease, so one of the key things is to understand that everyone is on that spectrum, from insulin sensitivity right up to severe insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, and to ultimately ask where you are on that continuum, and to put an objective, I suppose, line in the sand and say, listen, this is where I am. Am I doing okay from that perspective? And do I need to actually change my behavior from a lifestyle perspective to modify that?
So how do I get access to the professional that's going to answer me these questions? Like, if you take something like metabolic syndrome and you're looking at the 5 pillars of metabolic syndrome, I go in and I get tested. At the moment, my experience has been, I'm sure a lot of listeners have a mirrored experience here, that you're going in almost having to research the parameters before you go in and saying to the doctor, hey, can you check that I'm inside? A great example is, like you said, I went to my local GP and I got my full hormone panel done, got my testosterone results back. I think I was at 600, normal range is 300 to 1000. And I was like, okay, not super happy with 600. Like, what am I missing? How do I get to 1000? How do I get to right at the upper end of it? And she was basically like, you're fine. Like, you're on 600. Don't be worried about it. And much like you suggested, I said, look, when do you put a roof on your house? Best time to put a roof on your house is when it's not raining. Like, let me figure this out now rather than figure it out when my testosterone's at 200. Am I missing some of the key ingredients? Like, help me understand, do I have the raw materials necessary to create testosterone? Or am I missing something, or am I just in an age-related decline in testosterone? But it was so difficult to get answers to these questions.
And I think this is the challenge that again exists in terms of what you're trying to do there is apply a prospective approach to the avoidance of a major chronic disease. And I think largely what has happened is those questions are being answered in subspecialty areas, say with a physician who has an interest in the kind of management of testosterone. So and we're actually, to be fair, also seeing more and more primary care physicians developing subspecialty interests within those areas. I think, again, we have to understand that we maybe need to be different consumers of healthcare if we have needs and aspirations that are outside of the traditional model of healthcare. And so, again, this is, you have to, be much more engaged in terms of what your aspirations are and what your goals are and how you're going to hit them. And one of the things that I say all the time is that, I'm not here to tell people what to do. Who am I to say that? I'm here to help people hit their goals in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So people will say, well, what do you say to the person who's sitting home on the couch eating Doritos and smoking 20 cigarettes? And I say, I'm not your mother. Like if that's what you want to do, you do that, but I'm not going to tell you otherwise. I can lay out the facts and try and create a cogent argument as to why you shouldn't do that. But again, I think it is about understanding what your goals are and then kind of aligning with that. But I really do think that for a comprehensive assessment like that, they're hard to get, and often are leveraged by working independently with subspecialty physicians who have interests in those areas and to work towards that. In
a terminology I absolutely hate at the moment is this idea of hacks, biohacks, because hacks suggests there's a shortcut to something, that there's a non-traditional route to get there that's going to be quicker. And as someone who spent the last 2 decades entrenched in endurance sports, you realize the only cheat code is consistency and hard work. But we've seen these, I have friends messaging me going, oh, like I'm eating Doritos, I'm smoking, I'm drinking 4 nights a week, I'm in a caloric surplus every day, but I'm doing a cold plunge in the mornings. That's amazing. I heard it's going to fire up my metabolism and change white fat to brown fat, and I'm going to have this bumped up metabolism all day. And you're like, no, like there's no shortcut. You can't just do this. When you think about the different levers you can pull to stave off metabolic syndrome, I'm thinking strength, nutrition, sleep, aerobic training, stress. Where's the Pareto principle? Like, what's the levers you want to be pulling first?
For me, it's not a surprise that it's going to be exercise and nutrition. And I think, again, it comes down to what your aspirations and goals are. If you want to be a 100-meter sprinter or you want to be a long distance cyclist, the approach that you're going to be taking from an exercise perspective is obviously going to be quite tailored to that goal. But for most people who are, say, the middle-aged executive who's just trying to maintain some form of physical fitness, it's going to be just simple aerobic activity on a regular basis. We can get really specific about it. I try and encourage most of my patients to work specifically with a coach to get lactate threshold testing done, to get a really kind of dialed in approach to their zones. And I often find that doing that is actually really helpful because they can often then get much more kind of benefit from doing less intense exercise on a kind of a higher frequency basis. So it's not as exhausting doing kind of, they're not doing like 6 spin classes a week.
Yeah.
And so that they get the benefit from that. And then understanding that, giving them kind of more kind of precise guidance around, the fundamental basis of resistance training is to be able to functionally do what it is that you want to do over longer periods of time. And so when you present it like that, rather than the aesthetic appearance of something, it becomes a much more kind of compelling approach. So for me, it's are you hitting reasonable targets within your aerobic training across those zone systems and the energy systems that you're trying to optimize? Are you doing appropriate amounts of resistance training that get you to the muscle and strength goals that you're looking to achieve in terms of what you want to do? And that's just normal day-to-day stuff. Like, I want to go skiing kind of like once or twice or something like that. You're not trying to win any championships, but you just want to be able to do those things and keep up with your friends. And, if some of your friends say go out for a 5 or 10K run, that you can comfortably do that. So you don't have to be winning the Olympics, but it's nice to be able to hang out with your friends.
I'm always struck by in conversations like this, the advice you've given has been so similar to, Dr. Howard Lukes, Dr. Peter Seller. Like, you talked about not doing 3-4 spin classes a week, because the number one thing we need to do is maintain frequency, not have periods of time on a micro level or a macro level where we're inactive, where we go 4 months, 5 months without training at all. And the number one reason that I've seen that people break the frequency habit is too much intensity. You train too hard, you get injured, you get sick, or motivation dips off. And I'm struck by, in the mainstream media, they want to portray that there's so much division and conflict in how you should implement nutrition and how you should implement training. There's all these different schools of thought. But when you actually chat to very credible academics and practitioners like yourself, I'm always struck by there's so much more consensus than there is division.
Oh, 100%. And I think that the division is amplified just to create a unique perspective. You see this across all the different health domains. There's way more alignment than there is disagreement. And again, like where this, I think, is most pronounced is in the nutrition space. There is such, I think for some reason, there's such a moral valence to what it is that people eat. And in terms of when you're talking about sports nutrition and you're fueling someone to do a specific activity, that requires unbelievable precision in terms of how you're managing fuel over a particular duration, matching it to intensity and the person's goals. But for most people, that's not what they're doing. They're just not trying to be in a very substantial energy surplus. And we can look at this, in terms of, people ask, what is a normal weight? And for me, a normal weight is where you've minimized the amount of excess visceral fat that you have. That means that you're insulin sensitive. And so that's a normal weight for me. And the way that you get there is, if you're trying to lose weight, you have to be in a caloric deficit. There's no other human way to be there. But then you have to find a way that is an acceptable vehicle for you to be able to achieve that. And rather than getting into the diet wars of, is it vegetarian or vegan, or is it carnivore, or is it low carb? Is it ketogenic? Like, you have to ask, what is a reasonable vehicle for you to achieve that target, without causing a massive abnormality in other risk parameters, say like your lipid profile, that can often be the case in people who eat, say, a purely ketogenic or carnivore diet. And so it's actually, I think for me, looking at kind of most people who are trying to achieve reasonable things, using reasonable inputs and not trying to be overly kind of concentrated in one particular domain. In terms of, I think that's where most people will benefit the most.
Is the next frontier for you not, given there's so much consensus in this, it's not what people should be doing? Is it around behavioral change? How do we make people do the stuff they should be doing?
This is, hands down, burn on the biggest problem. As I like to say, your physiology doesn't care about your schedule. And the number one reason that people the reason that people don't do these things is mostly because they don't have time. We often, we live lives where we have given ourselves such little space to do the things that are important to us. And you have people who really want to focus on exercise and focus on nutrition and eat properly and have a much more kind of dedicated approach to these areas, but they find themselves without time. They find themselves doing long commutes. They find themselves working 60, 70 hours a week. And it's just incredibly difficult to fit in that time. And so for me, the way I look at this, I don't think I exercised more than 10 times during my time in college. I remember in college looking at the people who went to the gym, that it was mostly the American students, that they were just slightly strange, that these people who went to the gym. And I know that during my training, when I was working sometimes 100, 120 hours a week, there was no time for exercise. There was I lived on Lucozade, Yop, and Mars bars. And the probability of me being able to hit my metrics of performance were effectively zero. And I know that when I was coming to the end of my training as an interventional cardiologist, where I would more than likely have to work, incredibly long and hard hours doing call, very busy days, I just realized that if I was going to continue on that trajectory, I would not have had the time and space in my life to focus on the things that were important to me that would have leveraged my quality of life. And so I made a big, huge change. I changed my career entirely. I sacrificed a huge financial reward in terms of how I would work, but I unlocked an even bigger reward, and that was time. And so you have to ask, and I was fortunate enough that I was able to do that, but I made a huge sacrifice to actually have that opportunity and space in my life. But it's about priorities.
The pushback on that, and there's undoubtedly people that are time crunched. Like I have friends who have gone through medical school and are practitioners now, and I've never seen someone more time crunched than some of the medical students. But I think far fewer people are time crunched and think they're time crunched. Whenever I'm working with clients, like, oh, I can't fit this in, or just don't have time. I'm like, cool, pull up your iPhone and show me how much time you spent scrolling today. Show me your Netflix consumption. Like the Netflix CEO was speaking on Fast Money, and they asked him about Netflix's number one competitor. And I expected him to say, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus. He said their number one competitor is sleep. They're just trying to keep people awake to watch more and more. So I think so few of us are, and this leads maybe nicely to finish the conversation, to come full circle back into your idea of soul. I think so few people are mindful with how they're spending their time, that they're actually creating a more time crunched feeling than they actually have.
And I think this is where you need to be incredibly intentional about what you want your life to look like. And so we can only hit a goal that we can see. The famous parable of the Zen monk who basically was showing his trainee how to hit an arrow in archery to the center of the target when he was blindfolded, and then he missed by 60 feet. And the young Zen monk was going, oh God, this has gone terribly wrong. And he said, how did you expect me to hit a target I couldn't see? And so you need to work forward, and you need to be very intentional. You say, what do I want my life to look like? And how do I need to construct it? And just like you would for your health span and lifespan, you have to do so over a much shorter time frame, but with much more tactical goals. And you say, am I someone who's going to exercise 5 days a week? Well, if that's the case, and that's a high priority that it is for me in terms of that aligns with my internal value systems, then my life has to be orchestrated in a different way. Am I someone who focuses on my nutrition? And you have to believe that that is a possibility for you and then work towards it. Because if you don't see that as a target in the future for you, it's not going to happen. And for many people, and myself included, I had to do this. You have to become a different person. And if that isn't part of your life, you will have to reinvent who you are and then align yourself with that.
Dr. Paddy Barrett, I've absolutely loved this conversation. The work you're doing is super valuable, and I know people are going to get a lot of motivation to change their lives from this conversation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please click up here. There's another video I know that you're absolutely going to love. And we're just getting started, so subscriptions really matter. Click over here and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our amazing upcoming guests.